The morning fog clings to the weathered stone foundations like a shroud, refusing to lift even as the sun climbs higher over the Yorkshire moors. Each droplet of moisture seems weighted with memory, clinging to the ancient stones that have witnessed more than their share of secrets. The air carries the scent of heather and peat, mixed with something else, something that speaks of time standing still, of stories left unfinished. It's October 15th, 1979, exactly 100 years to the day since the Hartwell family simply ceased to exist. Thomas Hartwell, his wife Margaret, and their 3 children, Eleanor, aged 12, William, 10, and little Sarah, just 6 years old, vanished without explanation from their modest farmhouse on the outskirts of Whitby. The date itself seems cursed, as if the calendar page for October 15, 1879, had been torn from the book of time, taking 5 souls with it into oblivion. No bodies were ever found, no ransom demanded, no witnesses came forward. The family had simply dissolved into the mist like morning dew, leaving behind a mystery that would haunt this small Yorkshire village for a century. Their absence became a wound in the community's memory, a gap that no amount of speculation could fill. Children grew up hearing whispered stories about the vanished family. Teenagers dared each other to approach the abandoned farmhouse on Halloween nights, and adults spoke in hushed tones about curses and restless spirits whenever the autumn mist rolled in particularly thick. The farmhouse itself had stood empty for 3 years after the disappearance, its windows dark and accusing, its gardens slowly surrendering to weeds and wild growth. Even the hardiest Yorkshire farmers, men who feared neither weather nor hardship, found reasons to avoid the property when their work took them past its boundaries. Livestock refused to graze in the fields closest to the house, and more than one traveler reported their horses becoming skittish and unmanageable when the lane brought them too near the Hartwell property. Eventually, necessity overcame superstition. The land was too valuable to remain fallow forever, and in 1882, 3 years after the disappearance, a distant cousin of Margaret Hartwell arrived from Edinburgh to claim the property. But his tenure lasted only 8 months before strange incidents, tools that disappeared and reappeared in impossible locations, sounds of children laughing in the empty rooms, and a persistent smell of lavender that Margaret had favored drove him to sell the farm for a fraction of its worth. Over the subsequent century, the property changed hands 17 times, a record of ownership that raised eyebrows among local estate agents but somehow never quite prevented the next optimistic buyer from believing they could succeed where others had failed. Each new owner arrived with plans for restoration and renewal, and each departed with stories they preferred not to share with their replacements. The pattern became so predictable that local betting pools developed around how long each new owner would last, with the record holder managing just over 2 years before circumstances forced their departure. But today, builder James Morrison stands knee-deep in the cellar of that same farmhouse, his sledgehammer frozen mid-swing as he stares at what his demolition work has revealed. Morrison, a third-generation builder whose grandfather had actually worked on the original farmhouse construction in 1847, knows these old Yorkshire properties better than most. He's familiar with their quirks, their hidden spaces for storing contraband during the various tax rebellions, their priest holes left over from Catholic persecution, their ingenious solutions to problems that modern builders never consider. What he's looking at now, however, defies his considerable experience with historical architecture. The current owners, a young couple from London seeking a countryside renovation project, had hired Morrison's crew to expand the basement. The house's cellar, they'd complained, was barely large enough for storage, and they dreamed of converting the space into a wine cellar and perhaps a small entertainment area. The structural survey had indicated that the cellar could be safely expanded toward the north wall, where the natural rock formation would provide solid support for the proposed excavation. What they discovered instead would rewrite the final chapter of one of Yorkshire's most enduring mysteries. Morrison's crew had been working methodically through the north wall, removing stones that had been laid with the precision characteristic of Victorian-era craftsmanship. The mortar had proven surprisingly resistant, requiring more effort than typical demolition work, but Morrison attributed this to the quality of the original construction rather than anything more sinister. His grandfather had often spoken admiringly of the stonework in the older Yorkshire houses, built by craftsmen who took pride in creating structures that would outlast their own grandchildren. But as Morrison's sledgehammer finally broke through what he'd assumed was the exterior foundation, the sound that emerged wasn't the hollow echo of solid earth beyond. Instead, his hammer met empty air, and a rush of stale, cold air flowed out through the gap like the last breath of something long dead. The smell that accompanied this air made Morrison step back involuntarily. Not the mustiness he expected from an old foundation, but something more complex, something that spoke of deliberate concealment rather than accidental burial. Morrison sets down his hammer with trembling hands, his weathered face pale in the harsh glare of the work lights. Behind a false wall of carefully mortared stone, a wall that had remained hidden for exactly 100 years, lies a room that time forgot. The opening he's created is roughly 3 feet square, large enough for a man to crawl through but small enough that it could easily have remained undiscovered forever, if not for the planned renovation. The air that escapes carries the musty scent of secrets long buried, of lives interrupted, of a story that someone desperately wanted to remain untold. Morrison, despite 4 decades in the construction trade, and countless encounters with the unexpected discoveries that old buildings routinely yielded, finds himself reluctant to enlarge the opening. Something about the darkness, beyond whispers, of things better left undisturbed, of truths that carry their own burden of responsibility. But professional curiosity proves stronger than superstitious dread. Morrison carefully expands the opening, removing stones with surgical precision rather than his earlier demolition enthusiasm. Each stone that comes away reveals more of the hidden space beyond, and with each revelation the magnitude of what he's discovered becomes clearer. This isn't some forgotten storage alcove or abandoned coal bin. Someone had invested considerable time and effort in concealing this chamber, creating a space that could remain hidden indefinitely unless discovered by pure chance. When Morrison finally illuminates the space with his work lamp, the beam reveals a room that defies rational explanation. The chamber measures roughly 8 feet by 12, with stone walls that show chisel marks from their construction. The ceiling, barely tall enough for a man to stand upright, consists of carefully fitted stone blocks that would have required considerable engineering skill to install without compromising the structural integrity of the house above. But it's not the craftsmanship that captures Morrison's attention or explains the tremor in his hands as he adjusts his work lamp for a better view. Along the far wall, 5 wooden chairs sit in a neat row, facing a 6th chair positioned like a tribunal. The chairs themselves appear to be standard farmhouse furniture from the Victorian era, sturdy oak construction with simple lines that spoke of function over ornamentation. But their arrangement suggests a purpose far removed from domestic comfort. On a rough-hewn table nearby, personal effects lie arranged with deliberate precision that makes Morrison's skin crawl. A woman's silver locket, tarnished but intact, sits open to reveal a miniature portrait of 3 children whose faces seem to watch him from across a century of darkness. Beside it, a child's wooden toy horse, paint faded but still recognizable, stands frozen in an eternal gallop towards some destination it will never reach. A man's pocket watch, its chain coiled like a sleeping serpent, has stopped at 11:47, marking a moment when time itself seemed to surrender to the weight of whatever had occurred in this hidden space. 3 small dolls, their porcelain faces cracked but still bearing traces of the love with which they'd once been cherished, complete the tableau. These aren't random artifacts buried by time, but objects placed with intentional care, creating what feels less like a hiding place and more like a shrine. Or perhaps, Morrison realizes with growing unease, a confession written in objects rather than words. The discovery sends ripples through the tight-knit community of Whitby, where the Hartwell disappearance had become local legend, passed down through generations like folklore. Mrs. Emmeline Foster, whose tea room serves as the unofficial communications center for village gossip, finds herself at the center of conversations that shift between excited speculation and genuine fear. The discovery validates whispered theories that had persisted for a century, while simultaneously raising questions that no one particularly wants answered. Detective Inspector Sarah Chen, called in from York to investigate what might be a century-old crime scene, finds herself stepping into a case that predates her great-grandmother's birth. Chen, whose career had been built on methodical investigation of contemporary crimes, faces the unique challenge of applying modern forensic techniques to evidence that had been deliberately preserved by someone with unknown motives and questionable methods. The physical evidence she encounters challenges everything the community thought they knew about that October night in 1879. For a century, the prevailing wisdom had held that the Hartwells represented one of those families who simply vanished into the vastness of the British Empire, seeking opportunities in Australia or Canada that Yorkshire could no longer provide. Economic hardship had driven many families from the rural areas during the 1870s, and the Hartwells' disappearance had been filed, both officially and in the community's collective memory, under the comfortable category of voluntary departure. Standing in the hidden chamber, Chen's flashlight beam cuts through air thick with dust and history. Her training tells her to document everything before drawing conclusions, but her instincts recognize a crime scene when she sees one. The arrangement of the chairs, the careful preservation of personal effects, the deliberate concealment of the space itself, none of this speaks to voluntary departure or innocent explanation. The air grows colder as Chen processes the scene, though whether from the chamber's underground location or from the psychological weight of what she's witnessing remains unclear. These aren't random artifacts buried by time. Someone placed these items here with purpose, creating what feels less like a hiding place and more like a memorial. But memorials are built by the living to honor the dead, which raises the disturbing question of who had access to the Hartwell family's most personal possessions after their disappearance. Chen's preliminary examination reveals details that deepen rather than resolve the mystery. The locket contains photographs of the 3 Hartwell children, confirming the identity of at least some of the personal effects. But the presence of these items in the hidden chamber contradicts the official explanation of the family's disappearance. Families fleeing economic hardship might abandon furniture and farming equipment, but they would never leave behind precious photographs of their children or valuable items like silver jewelry that could be sold to fund their journey. The toy horse bears the initials WH carved into its wooden base. William Hartwell, the family's 10-year-old son, whose love of horses had been noted in the few contemporary accounts of the family that survived in village records. The dolls, examination reveals, are German-made, expensive items that would have represented a significant investment for a farming family of modest means. Their presence in the chamber suggests not only that the Hartwells hadn't departed voluntarily, but that someone had taken considerable care to preserve evidence of their former existence. But it's the pocket watch that provides the most disturbing evidence. The timepiece bears an inscription, "To Thomas, with love and hopes for our future. Margaret, Christmas 1876. The watch had been a gift from wife to husband, marking what contemporary records suggest had been a prosperous year for the family farm. But more significantly, the watch shows signs of recent winding when Chen examines it closely. The mechanism, while stopped, hasn't seized with age, as would be expected after a century of neglect. Someone had been maintaining this watch, keeping it functional, even while preserving it in this hidden memorial. Morrison's discovery forces the community to confront uncomfortable questions about their cherished local mystery. The comfortable narrative of voluntary departure dissolves under the weight of physical evidence that speaks to something far more sinister. For generations, parents had used the Hartwell story as a cautionary tale about the importance of perseverance during difficult times, explaining to their children that sometimes families must make hard choices and seek new opportunities in distant places. Now confronted with evidence that the Hartwells hadn't chosen to leave but had been prevented from staying, the community must grapple with the possibility that their village harbored a century-old secret that someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to preserve, while simultaneously concealing from discovery. Local historian Eleanor Blackwood, whose own great-grandfather had been among the original search party in 1879, arrives at the farmhouse carrying an armload of documents from the village archives. Her research over the past 3 decades had uncovered discrepancies in the official account that she'd been hesitant to publicize. Blackwood, a retired schoolteacher whose passion for local history had made her the unofficial keeper of the village's collective memory, had spent countless hours in dusty archives and church records, piecing together fragments of information that didn't quite fit the accepted narrative. Now, with Morrison's discovery lending credence to her suspicions, she feels compelled to share what she's learned. The autumn wind howls across the moors as Blackwood spreads yellowed papers across the kitchen table of the farmhouse, documents that tell a story far different from the one the community had embraced for a century. The original police reports, she explains to Detective Chen, contained several troubling inconsistencies that had been overlooked or deliberately ignored by the Victorian-era investigators. Thomas Hartwell's financial situation, while strained, wasn't desperate enough to warrant such a drastic escape. Recent harvest records showed promising yields, and the family had managed to make their mortgage payments consistently throughout the difficult period of the mid-1870s, when many of their neighbors had been forced to sell their properties. But it's another detail that causes Chen to lean forward with interest. According to witness statements from 1879, the Hartwells had been seen arguing repeatedly with their neighbor, Edmund Thorne, in the weeks before their disappearance. Thorne, a prosperous landowner whose property bordered the Hartwell farm, had apparently made several offers to purchase their land, offers that Thomas Hartwell had consistently refused. The investigation into Edmund Thorne's activities reveals a pattern of aggressive land acquisition throughout the 1870s. Several families in the area had sold their properties to Thorne under what contemporary accounts described as, quote, pressing circumstances. However, the exact nature of these circumstances remained vague in the historical records, protected by the discretion that rural communities typically afforded their most prominent citizens. Chen's team carefully documents every item in the hidden chamber, photographing each piece before removal. The preservation is remarkable, protected by the room's sealed environment from the degradation of time. Among the personal effects, they discover something that makes Chen's pulse quicken. A leather-bound journal belonging to Margaret Hartwell, its pages filled with increasingly frantic entries from the autumn of 1879. The journal entries paint a picture of mounting fear rather than financial desperation. Margaret writes of strange men watching their farm from the nearby hills, of livestock found dead with no apparent cause, of her husband receiving threatening notes that he refuses to discuss with her. Her handwriting becomes increasingly erratic as October approaches, the neat script deteriorating into hurried scratches that speak of terror rather than mere concern. One entry, dated October 10, 1879, 5 days before the family's disappearance, proves particularly chilling. Thomas spoke with Mr. Thorne again today. He returned home pale and shaking, saying only that we must be prepared for anything. He's hidden the children's birth certificates and our marriage license in the old oak chest, along with what little money we have saved. I fear we may need to leave this place, though Thomas won't explain why. There's something in his eyes I've never seen before, something that looks like defeat. But it's the journal's final entry that sends a chill through the investigation team. Written in Margaret's hand but dated October 15, 1879, the day of the disappearance. The words are barely legible. They came at twilight. Thomas was right. We should have left when we had the chance. God help us. God help our children. The implications of Margaret's words reshape the entire investigation. This wasn't a family fleeing their problems, but a family trapped by them. The hidden chamber begins to take on a different significance in Chen's mind. Perhaps it wasn't built to conceal evidence of the family's fate, but rather to preserve it, ensuring that someday someone would uncover the truth about what happened to the Hartwells. As word of the journal's discovery spreads through Whitby, longtime residents begin coming forward with stories their grandparents had shared in whispered conversations. Mrs. Agnes Fletcher, now 87 and the village's oldest resident, reveals that her grandfather had always maintained that Edmund Thorne knew more about the Hartwell disappearance than he'd admitted to authorities. According to family lore passed down through 3 generations, Thorne had acquired the Hartwell property for a fraction of its value just weeks after the family vanished, claiming they'd sold it to him before their departure. However, when Chen's team examines the property records from 1879, they find no documentation of such a sale. The farm had been transferred to Thorne through what the Victorian-era paperwork describes as settlement of outstanding debts, though no specifics about these alleged debts appear in any surviving records. The transaction had been processed with unusual speed, completed within a month of the family's disappearance without the typical legal procedures such transfers normally required. Further research into Edmund Thorne's background reveals a man whose rise to prominence in the Yorkshire countryside had been both rapid and mysterious. Born to a poor farming family in 1835, Thorne had somehow acquired enough capital by his 30th birthday to begin purchasing substantial tracts of land. His neighbors described him as charming but ruthless, a man who got what he wanted through means that weren't always entirely legal but were difficult to prove in court. The investigation takes on new urgency when Chen's team discovers that the hidden chamber contains more than just the Hartwells' personal effects. Beneath the wooden floorboards, carefully preserved in oiled cloth, they find documents that Thorne apparently believed were too dangerous to destroy. Contracts written in his own hand, agreements that reveal the true nature of his land acquisitions throughout the 1870s. These contracts paint a picture of systematic intimidation and coercion. Thorne hadn't simply made generous offers for his neighbors' properties. He'd orchestrated campaigns of harassment, designed to force families from their homes. The documents detail payments to local men for services described in euphemistic terms: property maintenance, livestock management, and tenant relations. But the amounts involved and the timing of these payments suggest activities far more sinister than legitimate farm work. One contract, dated September 1879, just a month before the Hartwell disappearance, proves particularly damning. It authorizes payment to 3 men for what's described as final resolution of the Hartwell matter, with a substantial bonus contingent upon complete discretion regarding methods employed. The contract bears Thorne's signature alongside those of 3 men whose names Chen recognizes from the 1879 police reports as witnesses who had claimed to see the Hartwell family loading a cart for departure. The pieces of the century-old puzzle begin to fall into place with horrifying clarity. The Hartwells hadn't fled their debts or sought new opportunities abroad. They'd been murdered by men in Edmund Thorne's employ, their bodies likely disposed of in the vast, desolate moors that stretched for miles around their farm. The hidden chamber had been Thorne's insurance policy, containing evidence that could implicate him if the truth ever emerged, but also serving as proof of his power over those who crossed him. But questions remain about who had constructed the hidden chamber, and why they'd chosen to preserve rather than destroy such incriminating evidence. The answer comes from an unexpected source: a letter tucked between the pages of Margaret Hartwell's journal, written in a different hand entirely. The letter is signed by Rebecca Thorne, Edmund's wife, and dated 3 days after the Hartwell family's disappearance. Rebecca's letter reveals the conscience-stricken confession of a woman who discovered her husband's true nature too late to prevent tragedy. She writes of overhearing conversations between Edmund and his hired men, of realizing that the mysterious departures of several local families hadn't been voluntary at all. But it's her description of the night the Hartwells died that provides the most chilling details. According to Rebecca's account, the family had been brought to the farmhouse cellar while still alive, forced to watch as their captors debated their fate. Edmund Thorne himself had been present, coldly explaining to Thomas Hartwell that resistance to his land acquisitions carried consequences that extended beyond financial ruin. The children had been kept in the main house while their parents were interrogated about the location of any documents that might implicate Thorne in previous disappearances. Rebecca's letter describes her horror at discovering what her husband had become, but also her terror of sharing the victim's fate if she attempted to intervene. Instead, she'd waited until Edmund departed on a business trip to York, then secretly constructed the hidden chamber with the help of a trusted servant. Together, they'd preserve the evidence of her husband's crimes, along with the personal effects of his victims, creating a time capsule that would someday reveal the truth. The letter's final paragraph explains Rebecca's motivation for preserving rather than destroying the evidence. "I cannot save the Hartwells now, but perhaps someday someone will uncover what Edmund has done and ensure that justice finds him, even if only in death. I pray that God will forgive my cowardice, and that the dead will forgive my silence. History records show that Rebecca Thorne died just 2 years after the Hartwell disappearance, officially from consumption but occurring with suspicious suddenness after she'd begun withdrawing from local social functions. Edmund Thorne remarried within 6 months of his wife's death, choosing a much younger woman from a distant county who knew nothing of his past activities. Detective Chen's investigation into the Thorne family lineage reveals that Edmund died in 1904, taking his secrets to the grave. His descendants had gradually sold off most of his acquired lands over the subsequent decades, apparently unaware of the blood money that had purchased their inheritance. The Hartwell farm itself had changed hands multiple times over the century, with each new owner experiencing what locals diplomatically described as unusual difficulties that eventually drove them to sell. The discovery of the hidden chamber finally explains these recurring problems. Previous owners had reported strange sounds from the cellar, tools that moved from where they'd been left, and a persistent sense of unease that seemed to permeate the property. What they'd experienced wasn't supernatural activity, but the psychological weight of a century-old crime scene, the echo of violence that had occurred within those walls. As autumn deepens around the Yorkshire farmhouse, Chen's investigation team carefully excavates the cellar floor, searching for any trace of the Hartwell family's remains. Ground-penetrating radar reveals several anomalies beneath the stone foundation, areas where the soil shows signs of having been disturbed and carefully recompacted. But after a century in the acidic moorland soil, any physical evidence of the victims has long since decomposed. However, the investigation uncovers something almost as valuable as physical remains, a complete picture of Edmund Thorne's criminal enterprise and the fate of at least 7 families who had disappeared from the Yorkshire countryside during the 1870s. Each disappearance had followed the same pattern: initial offers to purchase property, escalating harassment when those offers were refused, and finally, complete vanishing of entire families who had dared to resist Thorne's expansion plans. The documents preserved in the hidden chamber provide closure not just for the Hartwell case, but for multiple families whose disappearances had never been properly investigated. Victorian-era police, lacking modern forensic techniques and often deferential to wealthy landowners like Thorne, had accepted his explanations about voluntary departures and property sales without sufficient scrutiny. Word of the discovery spreads beyond Yorkshire, attracting attention from historians specializing in Victorian crime, and from genealogists researching families who had seemingly vanished from historical records during that period. The case becomes a landmark example of how modern investigative techniques can solve historical mysteries, providing justice that eluded contemporary authorities. For the current owners of the farmhouse, the discovery creates an unexpected dilemma. The property they'd purchased for renovation has become a crime scene, a place where multiple families met violent ends at the hands of a Victorian-era land baron. Some might consider such a history a burden, a darkness that would forever taint their dream of countryside living. But Sarah and Michael Davidson, the London couple who'd hired Morrison's construction crew, surprise everyone with their decision. Rather than abandon their renovation project, they choose to transform the property into a memorial for the Hartwell family and Thorne's other victims. The hidden chamber will be preserved as a historical site, allowing visitors to understand the full scope of Thorne's crimes and ensuring that the victims' stories are finally told. The memorial project attracts support from across Britain, with historians, genealogists, and descendants of Thorne's victims contributing funds and expertise. The farmhouse becomes a research center dedicated to investigating unsolved disappearances from the Victorian era, using modern techniques to examine cold cases that previous generations had been forced to abandon. Detective Chen, whose investigation finally brought justice to the Hartwell family after a century of silence, reflects on the case's broader implications. The hidden chamber represents more than just evidence of historical crimes. It stands as testimony to the power of conscience and the eventual triumph of truth over violence. Rebecca Thorne's courage in preserving evidence of her husband's crimes, despite the personal danger it posed, ensured that someday the victims would have their voices heard. As winter settles over the Yorkshire moors, the transformed farmhouse stands as a beacon of remembrance rather than a monument to forgotten violence. The rooms where the Hartwell children once played now house exhibits detailing their family's life and tragic end. The kitchen, where Margaret Hartwell had written her increasingly desperate journal entries, becomes a space for reflection on the vulnerability of ordinary families caught in the web of powerful men's ambitions. But perhaps the most powerful memorial lies in the restored hidden chamber itself, where Rebecca Thorne's letter remains on display alongside the personal effects of Thorne's victims. Visitors can see the silver locket that Margaret Hartwell might have worn while tending her garden, the wooden toy horse that had once brought joy to little William, the pocket watch that marked Thomas Hartwell's final moments. The case of the vanished Hartwell family serves as a reminder that truth, however long delayed, possesses a persistence that outlasts even the most carefully constructed deceptions. Edmund Thorne's wealth and influence had protected him from justice during his lifetime, allowing him to live comfortably with the blood of innocent families on his hands. But his widow's conscience proved stronger than his secrets, ensuring that eventually a builder with a sledgehammer would swing through the wrong wall and reveal a century of hidden truth. James Morrison, the builder whose demolition work had uncovered the chamber, often returns to visit the memorial site. He speaks to school groups about the importance of preserving historical truth, explaining how a routine renovation project can sometimes uncover stories that demand to be told. His sledgehammer, the tool that finally broke through Thorne's carefully constructed wall of silence, is displayed in the Farmhouse Museum as a symbol of how ordinary people can inadvertently become agents of justice. The Yorkshire countryside keeps its secrets close, buried beneath layers of peat and thyme, protected by the discretion of rural communities that prefer their scandals well-aged before consumption. But the Hartwell case proves that some secrets carry too much weight to remain buried forever. Eventually, the truth demands its day in court, even if that court convenes a century late, and the accused has long since faced whatever final judgment awaits those who profit from others' suffering. Detective Chen closes her file on the Hartwell investigation with a sense of satisfaction tempered by sorrow. Justice delayed may be justice denied, but sometimes it's the only justice available. The Hartwell family can't be restored to life, can't be reunited with descendants who never knew they existed, can't reclaim the future that Edmund Thorne stole from them on that October night in 1879. But their story can be told. Their names can be remembered. Their children can be mourned by a community that finally understands what was lost when they vanished into the Yorkshire mist. And perhaps most importantly, their case serves as a warning about the dangers of unchecked power and the importance of speaking truth to authority, even when that truth comes wrapped in danger. The fog still rolls across the moors each October morning, carrying the scent of peat and heather and memories long buried. But now it also carries something else, the knowledge that truth possesses a stubborn persistence that outlasts stone walls and powerful men and carefully constructed lies. Sometimes it takes a century for that truth to emerge, but when it does, it shines with the clarity of justice finally served and voices finally heard.